You ever watch a movie and think, what if the villain is kind of right? Well, what if a superhero villain held the key to a really uncomfortable truth about our own history? Today, we're looking at some source material that does just that. It uses Eric Killmonger from Black Panther to dig into let's just say, a very controversial take on the past. And it all kicks off with his own words. I mean, this quote really gets to the heart of who he is, right? The source argues he's not just some comic book bad guy. He's a product of this deep, profound betrayal and abandonment. Imagine it. Left completely alone to deal with the injustices of North America. That kind of experience, well, it creates this simmering hatred inside him. And that feeling, it becomes the engine for absolutely everything he does next.
Okay, so when you have that much rage, where do you even point it? You'd think it would be at his direct oppressors, right? But according to our source, that's not the whole story. It argues that his deepest hatred, that was actually reserved for Wakanda, his own ancestral home. Why? Because they had all this power to step in and help, but they just didn't. They sat back and did nothing while their brothers and sisters suffered.
And his plan for revenge, wow, it was massive. We're not talking about justice or equality here. Nope. The goal was to grab the throne, get his hands on all that Wakandan tech, and then use it to colonize the entire world. Our source even points out something interesting about his mask in the movie, how it kind of looks like Baphomet, a symbol sometimes linked to the Knights Templar. The idea is that this frames his whole mission as this twisted kind of holy war. But this is where the source's analysis takes a really interesting turn. It gets pretty complex, actually, because it argues that at the very heart of Killmonger's mission, there's this huge paradox. And this paradox, it reveals something much deeper and, honestly, way more troubling about the whole idea of liberation. So check this out. His stated goal was to liberate his people. Totally understandable. But his method? To colonize everyone else. I mean, think about that. According to the source, he wanted to fight oppression by literally becoming the biggest oppressor on the planet. It's a perfect, tragic example of that old idea that hate just creates more hate. And the thing is, Killmonger himself basically admits to this contradiction in the movie. He knows he's a product of his environment. He was trained by the very system he wanted to tear down. So in his big quest for liberation, he flat out says he was doing exactly what the white men programmed me to do. He ended up adopting the very mindset of the colonizer. Okay, now the source makes a really crucial pivot here. It argues that Killmonger isn't just some character in a movie. He's actually a symbol of a real repeating pattern in history. And to prove this point, it draws a direct line to a very famous historical figure, the African king Shaka Zulu. So the pattern is pretty clear, right? You've got this outcast prince, he's filled with hate, and he comes back to seize power and get his revenge. So let's take a look at how closely the source argues the real life of Shaka Zulu fits this exact same mold. And when you look at it, the parallels are pretty striking. Shaka Zulu, also an heir who was cast out into the wilderness. He also grew up with this intense hate in his heart. And when he finally got the throne, what's the first thing he does? He gets revenge on all the tribes that wouldn't help him. But here's the final and most critical step in this parallel, at least according to the source. When the European colonizers showed up, it was allegedly Shaka Zulu himself who sold out his own land and his own people. So this theme, this idea of internal betrayal, that's what the source starts calling the ugly truth. And this is where it pivots again, moving away from just individual leaders and zooming out to look at something much broader and, frankly, a lot more painful: the transatlantic slave trade itself. So our source, and it's citing scholarly research here, it outlines 4 main categories of people who were sold into slavery. But then it draws this just devastating conclusion from the data, that in every single one of these cases, the people doing the selling were other African people, selling their own. And the source is really clear on this next point. It argues this wasn't just a case of, warring tribes who saw each other as total foreigners. It claims that many of these neighboring West African tribes knew they had shared ancestry. They could literally trace how their families were connected. And yet, for selfish gain, they knowingly sold their own extended family into slavery. And this critique from the source, it doesn't just stop with the political leaders. It also points a finger at religious figures. It claims that high priests in many traditional West African religions were also complicit, that they were actually advising the chiefs on who to sell. The source's whole argument here is that Look, if we're going to hold other world religions accountable for their role in slavery, then we have to look at traditional African faiths in the same way.
All right, so this brings us to the source's final big conclusion. It takes all of these different threads. You've got Killmonger, you've got Shaka Zulu, and the history of the slave trade, and it weaves them all together into one really stark and very confrontational idea. And really, this is the core argument of the source material. It's saying that the awful, hellish brutality of slavery and colonization, yes, it was ultimately carried out by Europeans, but, and this is the key word, it was facilitated from within Africa, that it was, in the source's own words, a monster of our own making, one that was born from internal corruption and greed. And this leads to what is probably the source's final and most provocative statement. It argues that if you are a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, then your ancestor, by definition, could not have jumped from the slave ship, because if they had, well, you wouldn't be here. The really stark implication there is that they made a choice to endure. So we're going to end this exactly where the source material leaves off. With a direct challenge, it presents this version of history as a deeply uncomfortable truth, and it asks one last, really piercing question. There's no comfort here, no easy answers, just a set of really challenging ideas. And now, that question is left for you.